From the first day when the United States flag was raised in New Orleans, free people of color presented a troubling question for the Americans.
What Claiborne and Wilkinson commented on at that ceremony as they stood on the porch of the Cabildo looking out at the assembled people of New Orleans was the fact that there were all these militia units present to watch and participate in this moment of imperial transfer. And among the militia were free men of color. And these Anglo-Americans, old Virginian and this old general, were absolutely horrified. And there are not only free people of color, but there are armed free people of color, armed mulattoes, and they're just terrified.
When the Americans came to Louisiana and to New Orleans, one of the things that startled them was the tremendous amount of latitude that free blacks enjoyed. They were not prepared for that.
To most Americans, whites were free, blacks were slaves, and there was little room for anything in between. But Louisiana's gens de couleur libre, free people of color, didn't fit those categories. For a time, at the start of the 19th century, every other black person in New Orleans was free. The majority were French-speaking Louisianians called Creoles of color. Their heritage was a blending of French, Spanish, Indian, and African ancestry. Among Creoles, the lines between white and black were often blurred by family ties.
There's evidence that there was a lot of mixing between the races and the classes in New Orleans. I mean, there were families that had white members who were free people of color, and members who were slaves. Those people were tied together in families, and they recognized that. And they honored that. They honored their obligations to one another. It wasn't perfect. There were atrocities committed nonetheless.
Marriages between whites and blacks were prohibited, and it was against the law for a white man to have sexual relations with black women. Naturally, this law was continually ignored. Creole society permitted a white man to take a woman of color as his mistress. Free women of color would attend special masquerade balls where they could meet and socialize with white men of means.
If they found the appropriate white man, their mother would strike an arrangement, a plaçage type arrangement, in which the man would provide the woman with a home and subsequently educate their children and provide for them some amount of money for them over their lifetimes.
The beauty of this ballroom far exceeds anything of the sort we have at the North. There were about 40 women present of all shades, from the very dark mulatto to the light quadroon. Nearly all had masks, white masks.
But as Americanization continued, Louisiana grew to resemble other southern states more and more. Racial ambiguities among the Creoles and the great number of free people of color made the Americans increasingly uncomfortable.
When the free people of color, the Creoles, were noticed, they were seen as an economic threat because they owned property and they had acquired quite a bit of money and they had skills and education. So they were seen as a threat to the Americans.
Despite growing intolerance, Louisiana's free people of color made important and overlooked contributions to our history. And some of them grew to be very wealthy. In the Cane River area of Natchitoches Parish, French planter Claude Matoyer and his slave Marie-Thérèse Coincoin parented a large family. Once freed, Marie managed to liberate all her children, and they inherited large tracts of land, becoming plantation owners themselves.
Louis Matoyer became very successful. I think by the time he died, he was one of the largest planters, black or whites, in Natchitoches Parish.
His brother, Augustin, provided the money to build a Catholic church, the first to serve a congregation of free people of color in North America.
But what is interesting, though, was they lived sort of a marginal life, because legally they were free blacks. They were not free in the sense that whites were. They didn't have all the same privileges. Socially, obviously, they didn't have the same privileges that whites had. But on an economic level, they were probably better off than most whites.
Just like wealthy whites, some free people of color owned slave laborers and profited from the plantation economy. But more often, slaves were purchased by their own relatives so that families could be reunited.